honored to be here today. Thank you very much to GBBC for inviting us, and I think our panel will introduce themselves. But just first, I recently left DTCC, and one of the reasons I've been asked to moderate this panel is while I was at DTCC, I worked on a white paper with Euroclear and Clearstream and BCG, where we took a first step at identifying the risk and controls specific for digital asset securities. When we wrote this white paper last year, it was we were agnostic in terms of type of blockchain that we were referring to. GBBC has taken upon themselves with Oliver Wyman and members of the industry to really hone in on the specific risks for permissionless blockchains, public permissionless blockchains specifically. So before we discuss the topic at hand, I'd like to hand it over to my panelists to introduce themselves. So Rico?
Thank you. Rico Brandenburg. I'm a partner at Oliver Wyman, and I'm co-leading our operational risk and resiliency platform in the Americas, working with traditional banks, technology companies, fintechs, blockchain firms on kind of how to think about operational risks and how to think about the controls in order to mitigate those for the networks as well as the participants.
Hi everyone, I'm Kee Toh. I look at business architecture for Kinexys digital payments. So one of the cool things that we did recently was we published a report on payment tokens, how to design it, and I thought that was actually very relevant to some of the work that we are discussing today. So happy to talk more about that later as well. Just for a bit more background as well, before JP Morgan, I was actually at the Monetary Authority of Singapore and also at the BIS, where I used to lead CBDC projects. So this is a topic of a lot of interest for me. Thanks.
I'm someone who wishes we had this framework 3 years ago. And I'll get to that in a minute. So I'm Fernando. I'm the president of Chainlink. We've been pioneers in Web3 and DeFi for many years. And now we're building a runtime environment for financial institutions to safely transact on-chain. My previous role, actually, until last month, I was the CEO of SBI Digital Asset Holdings, which was, along with our friends from JP Morgan, the founding members of Project Guardian. And that was pretty painful, but I think we'll get to that during this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. My name is Nicolas Jacquemart. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for the Cardano Foundation, based in Switzerland. In a former life, I was working on the mostly policy, but also supervisory side for the Swiss Financial Market Supervisor, FINMA. Among other things, during the Libra project, right, which was a lot of fun. So in that sense, Fernando, I can echo, I wish we'd had this framework 5 years ago, because that would have been extremely helpful as a point of reference. And our interest in this project is primarily that for the conversations that we have about permissionless blockchain adoption, one of the challenges, especially when talking to financial institutions, is the question of risk, right? What is the risk framework? What are the differences? What is the same? Where can we tweak to change? Where do we really need sort of new categories to think about? And so this project is both super challenging and interesting, but also hopefully will be super helpful for the industry at large.
Great. So Fernando, you mentioned that you wish you had this process or this framework several years ago. Can you maybe just give us a little bit of background on some of the challenges that you addressed, that you had to address when you executed Project Guardian?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, my journey started around 2020. We started to look at things like Uniswap, ABI, Chainlink, you name it, and we felt that the tech and the approach that we see in DeFi had a lot of potential. It's like a peek into the future. This is what a couple of markets will look like. And we were looking for a partner to do an actual live transaction using this new tech. We were lucky to have someone like JP Morgan, who was, crazy enough to give this a try and risk being fired. But when we started our journey, realized that it's not just about the lack of legislation. I remember when we were about to start Project Guardian, I went to talk to the chief IT officer of SBI, my employer back then, and told Fernando, our procurement guidelines do not allow us something like DLT blockchain. This is not going to happen. This is on the tech side. And then we would go to talk to the global head of risk of SBI, who's looking at market risk, operation risk, you name it, and she would tell me, Fernando, there is no framework, there is no way we are going to allow you to touch any of this. So we would go, to our regulators. In my case, in Japan, JP Morgan, here talk to the OCC, also actually the MAS, because we're doing most of the pilot out of Singapore, and the regulator itself told us there are no frameworks for this. It is you guys who are trying to bring new tech, introduce new risks. So it's up to you guys to figure it out. So even though we thought we would be able to do this pretty quickly, we ended up trying to do what we are doing now with the risk and mitigation framework in a few months. And again, we didn't have any reference points, so we spent a lot of time with lawyers trying to identify new risks that we brought to the table. And the same lawyers told us, Fernando, you want to transact with JP Morgan, you want to do that live, it has to be contractual. You need to define what to do when someone loses the keys during a DBP transaction. How are you going to unwind whatever happened until things broke off chain? What is the accounting treatment on the balance sheet? What kind of reporting do we need to do to the Bank of Japan? There was nothing, literally. So we ended up having to ask, for an exemption from regulators in Japan, Singapore. Thank you, by the way. He was on the MAS side back then, and the same US. Then we had to get that in writing. So my head of compliance, my head of risk, the head of procurement was okay with it. And then we had to have too long to read a contract between JP Morgan and us to do a single trade. Trust me, that's not a scale. My CFO was not impressed. Fernando, you're telling me you spent, you want to know how much? Too much money in legal fees for this single trade, and there's no business case. What's going on? Yeah, so that's my story. I still have PTSD from those days, but I'm super thankful that now we have to start to build a framework that hopefully becomes the standard.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we put together the digital asset security control principles last year, because there was no framework. Yet we recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that when we put it together, we were blockchain agnostic. So maybe, Nicolas, can you maybe just describe why permissionless is so critical, and maybe give some of your thoughts on that front?
Sure, happy to. So I think one of the things that is key, right, for us at least, coming from really the public permissionless space, we believe that this infrastructure development is an opportunity to create a new infrastructure paradigm for the digital space. Now, personally, I don't believe that everything is going to move to blockchain. The reason being that decentralization and being public permissionless has costs, right, very fundamentally. It's not free. And as such, there are use cases that fit the cost. There are use cases that don't fit the cost. And one of the challenges in terms of the onboarding cost that we see regularly is really this question of, what is the framework that you put around it, right? As Fernando just so eloquently explained. Now, why do we think permissionless matters, and what do we think that means? Because this obviously goes into this thorny discussion about decentralization and what does that mean. The US obviously has quite a long history in both houses discussing decentralization as a potential criterion for whether something falls under legislative framework A or B. Personally, I think you can boil it down to two things that really matter. One is freedom to use, so freedom to access the infrastructure. Basically, there are no gatekeepers for using the database, right, for using the blockchain. And basically, you can self-custody, but you can also use a custodian, and all of that is basically open to anyone. The other piece is freedom to operate. So basically that the operation of the blockchain, becoming a node operator, is also not basically gate kept. And that's typically where I would draw the distinction between a permissioned public infrastructure and a permissionless public infrastructure is on the operation side, right? Typically public permissioned infrastructures, and we're generalizing here, right, but are open to use, but not as open to operate. So you'll get a more closed circle of operators. And that changes effectively the novelty of some of the risks, which I think is what Rico is going to talk about in a minute. So you'll get slightly different risks and mitigants depending on whether you're talking about public permissionless or public permissioned environments. And then there's also sort of the I would consider more traditional space, which is effectively the actual private permissioned environments where the distance to traditional Web 2 infrastructures, cloud services, becomes very, very small, right, in terms of the risk framework. There are still differences, but it isn't as big as it is. The gulf is not as big, and I think the challenge is not as big as it is for the public permissionless side. So effectively what we wanted to do with the framework, in my mind, was start and solve the hardest part, which is where the distance is the largest to the existing risk frameworks. Because if you solve that, then I think you can iterate yourself towards all of the things in between, right? All the versions of infrastructures that exist in the space in between.
And maybe Rico, can you maybe just elaborate a little bit on some of those novel risks? Like where is that gulf that Nicolas is describing?
Yeah, the way that we are thinking about kind of the risks and the mitigants overall is really looking at, as Nicolas was describing, there are new risks that need to be mitigated that are not within kind of existing risk management frameworks, whether that's COSO, NIST, CSA, or we need potentially controls because the risks are, the existing controls are not capturing to the extent the risk exists in permissionless networks. And the things that we're thinking about are things like, if we think about technology risk, we don't see something like node concentration in like traditional infrastructure. How do I mitigate this? How do I think about kind of more diverse validator network? Consensus attacks is something from an information security cyber perspective that a traditional information security program wouldn't be concerned about. But if I'm in a permissionless network, how do I think about this and what kind of controls do I put in place in order to mitigate that risk? But even if I move beyond just the traditional technology kind of components into things like financial crime, complex international transactions, the fact that it's very difficult to identify, to do KYC on kind of customers and participants. How do I still make sure that I'm able to satisfy my obligations with my regulators and mitigate the risks that I'm exposing the network to? And also from like a business continuity perspective, blockchains enable more availability, like have a lot of benefits, but they also don't necessarily enable to implement the traditional business continuity and disaster recovery capabilities. So how do I think about that in the context of a decentralized network, like for example, recovery capabilities? How do I enforce that on the different L1s, L2s? How do I make sure they can actually help the participants when you are in those situations? And then lastly, I think that the kind of fourth area is third-party risk management, where just the interaction model between the participants and the different kind of network operators and like different L1s, L2s is just not necessarily as contractual as they would be for kind of traditional third parties. So how do you make sure that you move much more towards like monitoring and influence and governance over them in order to make sure that you as a participant can actually control the risks that you're exposed to?
And can you maybe just provide a little bit of context of the project that Oliver Wyman's been driving with GBBC?
Yeah, so we started out GBC, its members and Oliver Wyman started out with really thinking about what are those core risks that permissionless blockchain is exposed to. And our core objective was really to create a kind of concise, adaptable standard that can be used for regulatory interaction to really drive the regulatory dialogue and remove obstacles, because as Fernando and Nicolas was saying before, when they started their projects, the fact that there was no framework in place was a problem, because there was nothing to point to basically say, here are the types of risks and control objectives that I actually want to consider when developing these projects. And the way that we're thinking about it is like really in three phases. Phase one was focused on kind of the taxonomy, the foundation, and making sure that we have kind of tokenized securities covered. That was kind of Q1, Q2 of this year. Q3, Q4 will be focused on kind of the expansion to level 2 companies within the network, and digital payments. We excluded digital payments just because of the complexity as part of phase one, which will hopefully finish by the end of the year, and then 2026 will be focused on kind of crypto assets that are native to the blockchain.
Now, Wiki, one of the things that we've talked about is that for public chains, either permissionless or permissioned, there are very specific risks associated with them. Now, can you maybe just give a little bit more clarity in terms of like why you think if you're operating on a private chain, you don't necessarily need to look at a more comprehensive risk and control framework, and why you believe that your current frameworks that organizations might have may be applicable and may be sufficient at this point?
Yep. So maybe I'll explain it in terms of the category of risk and then how we kind of apply them to the different type of networks. So from a risk perspective, I would broadly categorize it into general technology risk, cybersecurity risk, including data leakage, and finally governance risk or governance concerns. Now, if you think from a network perspective, you could think of it as a private permission network, you could think of it as a consortium network, and finally a public blockchain network. So what we have currently today is a private permission network that runs fully within JP Morgan. So this is what we are using for Kinexys today. From a risk management perspective, this is really no different from using a different technology stack. Because, rather than using your typical Apache, SQL, and Java, you are just using Quorum, Web3j, and Solidity. That's probably a good reference of how we would think about it. So if you're just swapping out the technology stack, then essentially the biggest concern is just technology risk. And this is things that we are doing all the time. We know how to manage it. We know how to test it out. We know how we can get comfortable with the technology. So that is a private network. Now, once you start looking at it as a consortium network, essentially now, you have multiple parties running nodes. But even then, typically, it is still run by known parties. There's very often an operator associated with the network itself. So in that case, you still don't have the same type of governance concerns. Your biggest worry is really more from a cybersecurity perspective, because your threat surface has widened now. You are connected to a lot more parties, and you are all transacting on a common network. Again, that is something that we know how to manage. Now, the next level is actually for us the biggest jump, because once you start looking at the public blockchain, then there is the governance concerns around like who is actually the operator of the network, what are the SLAs associated with the network, what happens if something goes wrong on the network. So that's the part which I think we are trying to understand better. What are the associated risks? How do we actually manage them? And this is the part where I believe that a risk framework will actually make it a lot easier, not just for us, JP Morgan, but really for all the other banks and financial institutions looking to take advantage of public blockchains.
So Wiki, once we actually have this framework in place, like how do you anticipate using it? Can you maybe just walk the audience through like how you envision like you would use this framework?
So the way I see a framework is that it's always a starting point. It's actually never the end point. It is a starting point which the banks would then have to start layer on our own internal concerns. But of course, the more comprehensive a framework is, the closer it gets us to the end point itself. So one of the worries that, especially when dealing with new technology, is that we don't know what we don't know. So, if I'm completely new to a technology, there are just certain concerns that I might not even be aware exist out there. So what I find very helpful from a framework perspective, and coming through the collective knowledge and expertise of multiple parties, especially parties who have done live projects, live usage of public blockchains, is that it helps us to cover our blind spots. It helps us to expose our blind spots. It helps us to understand what we don't know, so that we can figure out how we can mitigate the risk. So that, to me, is one very important part of it. The other important part of it is really from a regulatory engagement perspective, because similar to us, I think one of the fears from a regulators is they might not know what the risks are. But once you have some of these frameworks out there, it really helps a lot from an education perspective. I'm going to use an example from a report we recently published on payment tokens. One of the key findings that we were trying to explain is that, even if you were to use a permissionless network, you still have the ability to implement controls. Generally, people equate a permissionless network with a lack of controls or an inability to implement controls. So what we actually tried to explain in the report itself is that we are able to implement the same type of payment controls, the same type of administrative controls on the smart contract layer, even if it were to be deployed on a permissionless network. So to me, these are really important from a regulatory engagement perspective because we help to clarify some of the misconceptions around new technologies. We help regulators to understand what are some of the concerns that we should be worried about and how we can actually manage them.
And Fernando.
Can I make a comment? Because I feel that the financial institutions, right, think that this DL2 thing is something that is outside of their domain. There's a tendency to treat DLT like you would treat AWS or Azure. And I would argue that the end game here is that the financial institutions will be part of the governance of the network itself. It's just like the internet. You have internet service providers. You have autonomous systems. I don't think we can keep saying forever, this is someone else's problem. I think the financial institutions, I would argue also the public sector, would play a role in the governance itself, and that's going to change the risk profile. Again, that is my assumption. I have two former regulators here with me, so I'll be careful, but that would be my thesis.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point, right? Currently, governance in the public permissionless space is largely dominated by Web3 native companies. There are effectively no financial institutions that I'm aware of that participate in effectively public permissionless governance. And I think if you do compare it to the internet, right, these databases, they don't tell you that you need to use it for financial products. They don't tell you what they're for. They're completely use case agnostic. You could do track and trace on a public blockchain, and you can use it as a trust layer for that. You can do digital identity, or you can do financial products. And I think what we're seeing now, because the first two of those categories are it's already being used for that, right? Not at giant scale, but it is being used, and there are examples of it. And I think in the financial market so far, we haven't really seen much beyond POCs and pilots in terms of people actually doing it. And I think Fernando's point about, the cost of getting to one transaction, right, is very pertinent for this discussion, because that's the problem. If one transaction costs you 3 years and 15 exceptions to policy, then you're never going to get to any kind of scale. But on the governance side, I really do think that the financial institutions need to, over time, get comfortable with the idea of participating not just as users of the infrastructure, but actually of governance participants of the infrastructures themselves. And I think that will also in time change the risk profile of the governance piece of this discussion, which at the moment does have a tendency of being, oh, we don't want to touch that, right? That sounds super risky. We don't know what we're getting into. And I think there are a number of layer ones that are working very hard, including Cardano, on the governance side of things. It is still very much work in progress, but we are trying to get to frameworks where you have a sort of a set of rules and agreements around the governance side of things, so that people can get more comfortable engaging on that front.
Nicolas, I just wanted to add one point. So from a bank perspective, I mean, the value of governing something is only if we are using it. So the first step is really getting financial institutions to use it first. And once they start using it at scale, that's the part where we start to realize that, hey, if we don't take a big role in the governance of it, then there starts to be certain issues that we might be concerned with. So to me, once there is adoption and usage, the governance part of it will naturally follow.
But that's also...
Sorry, Rico. I would just say, I agree with you, that would be ideal, but in my experience talking to banks about adoption in particular, what you will often get is this is kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? They will say, well, we don't understand the governance piece, we're uncomfortable with it, and then you say, well, why aren't you part of it? You can be part of it, right? That's what the permissionless environment typically allows. And then they'll say, we won't touch it until we feel comfortable with the governance, but we also don't want to be part of the governance. So, I think it depends on the bank, though, right?
So do you think that this framework that we've been working on will actually help with that dialogue and help break down and educate the banks and regulators so they do understand, the risks, so they will come into the market?
I mean, that's the hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, the chicken and egg thing, and I think that was the key purpose of the framework, is really making sure that you have something to point to say most of the kind of mitigants for the novel risks are really the first step is making sure that you're participating in the governance of those networks, rather than, as you said, just be a participant and treat them as traditional third parties at arm's length.
So how is Oliver Wyman going to take this framework? What's your perspective on that?
So once we have basically agreed and finalized the draft of kind of the first phase, we will really work with our clients, the banks, but also technology firms, fintechs, on trying to see how we can integrate that framework into existing operational risk management frameworks. So it becomes really an integrated approach of how we are managing different types of infrastructures, rather than, as you said before, treating this as kind of something very separate. It should be an integral part of how we are managing the financial kind of system more broadly. And I'm sure there's also kind of industry, the Analysis and Resiliency Center, once more kind of financial institutions are starting to use that, they will look at how can you mitigate like the systematic risk more effectively, which also will make financial institutions much more comfortable with the use of those networks.
Right. And then Fernando, just in your new Chainlink hat, like how do you see this framework being applied to what Chainlink has been working on?
I think the complexity is going to be quite mind-boggling. If you look at the internet, in the 90s, and I'm going to show my age here, people were talking about TCP/IP, IPX all the time. There was a lot of hype about that. Who talks about TCP/IP those days? And I remember developing apps in the early 90s, and you need to be conscious of what was the particular protocol that you were using. That was not the right abstraction layer. And I would argue that if in 3-5 years we start talking about blockchains, we've been successful. But to get there, we need like an operating system, who's the wrapper around all of that. We need a runtime environment that developers can use without need to worry about all these risk frameworks, all the complexity, because the runtime environment will take care of that. That's what Chainlink is building. And I think this is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Rico, so what's next? I know you talked about the fact that we're trying to wrap up and get the paper out by July, August timeframe. Then we're moving into phase 2 and phase 3 beyond that. We're expanding to stable coins, layer 2s, and then ultimately into crypto. But how, or individuals in this audience are interested, how can they become involved?
We really want to have, everyone needs to participate in kind of the maintenance, refinement of that framework. And we really want to encourage everyone to kind of get in contact, like understand what the framework is about, and also make recommendations on how to improve it going forward. And I think the previous panel mentioned it like quite clearly. It's like education of like regulators, education of financial institutions, and everyone in this room can help and participate in like actually making sure that the word gets out. There is a framework in place which may not be 100% right, but gets you to like 80% confidence and is matured and improved over time. So that's where like everyone in this audience can be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, we are open sourcing it, so we'll be available for feedback. But if you are interested in this topic, and if it resonates with you, one of the roundtables tomorrow at 11:30 will be discussing this. So I would encourage you to attend that roundtable. Before we wrap up, any last comments?
I think just maybe to summarize from like the discussion here, we, GBBC, the members and us really thought that having a framework in place that allows like effective management will drive more participation, will drive more confidence from financial institutions and regulators in blockchain. And I can only echo what Fernando said. If in 5 years we don't talk about blockchain anymore, we have achieved what we wanted to achieve.
I would just quickly, in terms of sort of final words, to me as a former regulator now working sort of in the permissionless blockchain space on the policy side, this journey is going to require one thing that I think this industry has historically struggled somewhat with, which is a certain degree of humility with regards to the genuine risk concerns that both regulators and financial institutions have, particularly about public permissionless systems. right? And addressing those risks in a way that does not compromise fundamentally the nature of public permissionless infrastructures. Because if we end up just going back to the traditional Web 2 of doing things, then we might not as well not have bothered. And I think there is a trend in the industry at the moment on the public permissionless side to try to compete directly with traditional cloud infrastructures at the cost of the public permissionless piece. And at that point, you kind of have to start asking yourself, well, what's the dividing line here, right? And so that's just something to consider.
So I would like to, on my side, with an ask, right? I really would like to invite everyone to be part of the governance. In the internet, it was a bit the same. The telcos in the late 90s, early 90s were running the show. But eventually, the likes of IBM, Google, the hyperscalers became almost equal to so-called internet service providers. They became what in the internet we used to call autonomous systems. And I think the same is going to happen with blockchain. Now it's random people running nodes, but I would argue that eventually many of the stakeholders will be part of the governance. We've seen this before, just like internet was messy in the 90s, the early days. DLT is really messy these days, but it's a way forward if all of us, join forces and participate. Thank you.
Well, do you want to say something?
So I just wanted to add one analogy. So, when I was at MES 10 years ago, no financial institution were truly using cloud services. So there was this period of time where it was just so difficult to use cloud. But at some point, the regulators stood in. I still remember being at Singapore FinTech Festival. The managing director of MES, Ravi Menon, was on stage saying that MES has no concerns with financial institutions using cloud services, and that started the whole acceleration. And today, even for us, Kinexys, we are completely on the cloud. And so I do feel like we need something like that, even for public blockchains. At some point, certain central banks, regulators coming out and saying that most of these risks have been addressed, and we hope to do that through the risk framework itself, just helping regulators understand that risk can be addressed and they really shouldn't have concerns, subject to adequate risk management from the financial institutions. And that, I feel, is how we are going to see adoption of public blockchains in the coming years. And like what Fernando was saying, maybe 10 years from now, no one will be talking about it because everyone is on it. I guess that can be only our wish and hope for what's going to happen in the coming years.
I can't wait to see the future. But I want to thank our panelists. We're out of time. And if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you, as I mentioned earlier, to come to the roundtable tomorrow at 11:30.